Hello, and welcome again to another discussion in Christian Evidences or Christian Apologetics. Today, I wanted to invite you to my house. We're actually taping this on my deck at my house outside today. It's a beautiful day outside. Because we're outside, of course, we're going to get all sorts of ambient noises, cars driving by. You may hear a lawnmower down the road here a bit, and there's a dog over here that yaps every once in a while, but I don't think he'll interrupt our talk too much. And today, I want to talk about the most significant event in Christianity. As a matter of fact, many people would say even the most significant event in the history of the world. And that, of course, is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Certainly very, very important. Why? Why is the resurrection so important? Well, let me give you 4 reasons why it's important before we talk about defending the resurrection. First of all, it's important because the resurrection vindicates Jesus' message and his identity. Okay, Jesus spent his entire life, according to the gospel accounts, claiming to be God. And he did certain miracles in order to substantiate that claim. But the biggest miracle he did was the resurrection. By conquering death, by conquering sin and evil, Jesus showed, in fact, that he was God. And Romans 1:4 tells us that he was declared to be God by the power of the resurrection. That's one reason why the resurrection is so important. Second of all, of course, the resurrection is very important because of all the things Jesus did. This is the most strongly evidenced one that we have here. We have good, strong evidence to support the resurrection, as I hope to show you in the discussion we're going to have today. Third reason why the resurrection is important is it's a source for our hope for eternal life and fellowship with God. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians that if there is no resurrection, then our faith is in vain. And so everything we believe as Christians depends upon this specific event that occurred in the life of Jesus. And finally, there's a philosophical reason why the resurrection is important, and that is that it shows that the primary claim of Christianity, Jesus Christ is God, he rose from the dead, is falsifiable. Now, what do I mean when the claim is falsifiable? Well, I don't mean that it's false or anything along those lines. When we say that a claim is falsifiable, we simply mean that there's a way to test it to find out if it's really true or false. If I made a claim to you about something, for example, if I said to you there are little green men living inside the moon, eating the moon from the inside out, and if you were to ask me, well, can you prove that? If I told you, well, no, there's no way to prove that claim at all. Well, then the claim would be kind of meaningless. If it can't be proven to be true or false, it doesn't really have any meaning at all. When you ask me if I could prove it, what you're asking me is, can I falsify the claim? Well, Paul tells us that if the resurrection didn't happen, Christianity isn't true. So we have actually a way of falsifying Christianity, and that's important for philosophers. That shows that we're making a meaningful claim here, and it's a claim that we think we have good reasons to believe, in fact, are true. Now, how do we go about defending the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Well, there's a traditional way we can approach this idea of defending the resurrection. And the traditional way is basically the way we've kind of been going a little bit in this course, defending the historical reliability of the Gospels. And once we've done that and shown they're substantially reliable, then we use material from the Gospels to be able to defend the fact that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. This is a good approach. There's certainly nothing wrong with it. It's a very valid approach to do, of course, but it is an approach that takes an awful lot of work and an awful lot of burdensome to do. First, we have to go through a lengthy process of defending historical reliability, okay, before we can then go on and talk about the resurrection here, okay? And we have to deal with a lot of critics, and we have to do a lot of skeptics, what they have concerning those particular issues here. In recent years, Dr. Gary Habermas, an expert, world expert on the resurrection, who teaches here at Liberty University, developed a new way of defending the resurrection. Based on a minimal number of what he called core facts, he believes he could defend the resurrection with just a few facts here. Now, he had 2 criteria that fall into this area that we call minimal core facts. First of all, we're only going to use data that's strongly evidenced, and second of all, we're going to use data that's granted by virtually all scholars on the subject, even many skeptical ones. Now, of course, you can see immediately the value of using a core facts argument here. It simply makes it less work for me to do. It cuts down on my work considerably here, okay? If I remove the facts that are debatable, then I don't have to support those facts, and I only have to use the facts that we all agree with here. And the facts that I want to use are ones that almost all scholars across the board agree with these particular facts here. There are many facts about the resurrection that may in fact be true, but they're not pertinent to my defense, or they're debatable, or they're controversial or something. And so I'll put those facts aside. An example, okay? The Gospels tell us that the Pharisees placed Roman guards at the tomb of Jesus. Many skeptics are skeptical of that for a number of reasons we won't go into, okay? Well, I happen to believe that that's true, but I don't need that fact in order to defend my defense of the resurrection, so I'm not going to bring that fact up maybe a lot of times in my particular defense, okay? Those kinds of facts aren't necessary. So what we want to do is we want to look at 5 facts, okay, that basically are facts that all the scholars agree with, okay, that become the core facts concerning the resurrection. Now, before we do that, let's back off a little bit here. Dr. Habermas, in his discussion, first starts off with 12 facts concerning the resurrection that almost most scholars agree with. Okay, not all of them, but most of them pretty much agree with these 12 facts. What are these? Well, number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Number 2, he was buried. Number 3, the disciples were in despair concerning his death. Number 4, the tomb was empty a few days later. Number 5, the disciples believed that they had seen the risen Christ. Number 6, the disciples were transformed later on from their despair to being bold and brave witnesses for Christ. Number 7, the resurrection was the message of the early church. Number 8, the resurrection was proclaimed in Jerusalem. Number 9, the church was born into and grew into a significant movement in just a few years. Number 10, Sunday became the day of worship. Number 11, James, a skeptic, became a believer. That's James, the brother of Jesus. And number 12, Paul, a persecutor of Christians, became a believer. Now, while a number of scholars accept these 12 facts, there are still a number of skeptics that would question some of these. So Dr. Habermas suggests that we could trim this list down quite a bit considerably and still offer a strong defense for the resurrection. Now remember the value here. The less facts that I use, the more agreement I'm going to get amongst my scholars and amongst my skeptics. I think I can give 5 facts that I would say 95 to 98% of scholars, even some skeptics, would actually believe. Well, let me give those 5 facts and defend each one of them. First of all, my first fact is that Jesus died. Okay, the death of Jesus. This fact is attested not only in the Gospels, but also externally attested. Tacitus, Lucian, and the Talmud all talk about the death of Jesus, totally apart from the Gospels there at all. Matter of fact, this fact is so universally accepted that John Dominic Crossan, who is one of the critics, one of the skeptics that's out there, has actually stated that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can be. If the Gospels are reliable from what we know of crucifixion methods, they seem to be, then consider the following. Okay, first of all, Jesus was brutally beaten. He was whipped terribly to the point where the flesh was probably hanging off his body, and it caused a tremendous loss of blood. Okay, then he was crucified with nails to the hands and the wrists, also resulting in a great amount of blood loss. His legs were not broken. Now you may say, well, how is that evidence, his legs not being broken? Well, it was common that crucifixion victims would hang for a long time, and the soldiers would get tired of waiting around for them. Okay, the way that when you were crucified, your hands were lifted up so high that you had to raise yourself up in order to just to take a breath and then lower yourself back down. Okay, and in fact, the way crucifixion victims actually died was from asphyxiation. They simply couldn't breathe anymore. Their muscles just simply gave out, and they couldn't push themselves up anymore, and they slowly just simply died of starvation of air, okay? Well, the guards oftentimes didn't want to wait for the long time that these crucifixion victims might take to finally wear down themselves. So they would actually go around and break their legs. By breaking their legs, it simply would not allow them to raise themselves up in order to breathe, and they would run out of air in a very short period of time. They did that to the other 2 members of the cross, so we're told in the gospel accounts. But we're told with Jesus, his legs were not broken at all. Okay, the fact that his legs weren't broken was a sign that he was already dead. Just to be sure, though, the gospel accounts tell us that a spear was thrust through his side, okay, piercing his heart, that blood and water came out of the heart, which, by the way, medical doctors tell us that Jesus died of heart consumption. Okay. And the thing to remember here is that these were professional executors. These aren't amateurs. They know what they're doing here. They know when the person is dead here. So therefore, we have strong reasons to believe that, in fact, Jesus really died from crucifixion. That's our first fact. Our second fact is the despair and then later transformation of the disciples. The picture of the disciples during the arrest and the trial and the crucifixion were men of great despair, frightened men. They had totally given up hope. Their great leader, Jesus, had died, okay? And they'd just simply given up, and all the hope in them had simply vanished. They, of course, had no idea of a resurrection going to occur, even though Jesus told them that many times. Just the events of the crucifixion were overwhelming to them, and they thought for sure things were over at that point. And yet, a few days later, they changed into these bold men who were great witnesses and believers in Christ, men who were willing to even die for what they were preaching at that particular point, men who would go through great suffering throughout their lives. Here's the question. What would cause such a change in these men? You have to account for that historically, okay? So our second fact we have to think about is the despair and then later transformation of the disciples. How do we explain that? Okay. Third fact that we have to deal with are the disciples claim to have seen the risen Christ. This is the most agreed upon single piece of evidence, in fact, that virtually all scholars agree on, okay? Now note here, we're not saying that scholars agree that the disciples actually saw the risen Christ. We're simply saying that all scholars agree that the disciples claim to have seen the risen Christ in some way or another. This is testified not only in the Gospels, but it's testified in Paul's letters. For example, in 1 Corinthians, in chapter 15, Paul gives a bold statement about how Jesus Christ rose from the dead here. Early creedal statements have this, and we even have external evidence that the disciples made this claim. Josephus, in his book on the Jewish wars, talks about how the disciples claimed that Jesus had risen from the dead. Now again, we're not saying that this is evidence that they did see Jesus. We're just saying they made the claim, okay? And we have to explain that. Historically, you have to account for why would the disciples be making this particular claim here. The transformation of their lives and their subsequent martyrdom shows not only that they made this claim, but they actually really believed that this claim was true. Again, a fact we have to account for. Our fourth fact that we have to account for is the empty tomb. Now, I need to tell you right away that this fact is the one fact I'm giving in my core facts that actually there's less than the 95% agreement on, okay? Although in a recent study Dr. Habermas did, he showed that in fact maybe about 75% of scholars agree that the tomb was in fact empty at this particular point. And of course, the idea of the empty tomb simply makes sense. Okay, the disciples preached the resurrection right there in the heart of Jerusalem. Okay, if he hadn't risen from the dead, anybody could simply go to the tomb and produce the body and cart it through the streets and show that the disciples were just simply giving us a lie or telling us the truth or were deluded in some way or another. This would have killed Christianity right in the cradle at that particular point. But in fact, we have two lines of evidences that in fact the tomb was really empty. First of all, the stories of the disciples stealing the body were circulated very early. Okay, it's interesting that the enemies of Christianity very early on started to circulate these stories that the disciples stole the body. Now, why would they circulate a story that the disciples stole the body if the body was still in the tomb and they could prove that? That was evidence that the body must not have been there in some way or another. So we have an empty tomb. A second line of evidence that points to the empty tomb is that the earliest witnesses that we have of the resurrection or the tomb being empty were women, okay? A fabrication, a made-up account that the tomb was really empty, probably would have had men as the witnesses, because in those days, women were not considered reliable witnesses. Okay, now I'm not saying anything about women at this point, but that in fact was the case in that culture. Okay, you would never produce a woman as a reliable witness in trying to prove a case. You'd always have a man to be there. The fact that they use women fulfills a criteria we call the criteria of embarrassment. This is something that's kind of embarrassing. And that means it's probably really true. A fabrication would have cleaned that up, would have gotten rid of that. But the fact that we have women shows that we have probably a true account. So I think we have good reason to believe that in fact the tomb was empty as well. Finally, our fifth evidence that I want to support, our fifth fact that we have to account for, okay, is the conversion of Paul himself. Paul was the great persecutor of the church. His persecution was due to the early Christians' worship of the risen Jesus. I mean, that's why he persecuted them, because they believed Jesus was risen from the dead, okay? Yet he claims to have been transformed 180 degrees, completely opposite, to the point where not only he's not persecuting anymore, he's actually going out proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus Christ here, okay? This is significant here, okay? We have an appearance here, not to a believer, but we have an appearance of the risen Christ to an unbeliever, because that's what Paul was at the time Jesus appeared to him, an unbeliever at this point. When Jesus appeared to Paul, he was an enemy of the church. So we have testimony here, not only by friends of Christianity, but we actually have testimony by somebody who was a foe of Christianity, that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Okay, Paul eventually died for this belief. He was executed in Rome because he preached the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay, what would cause a man to go through a tremendous transformation like that? I mean, the transformation of the disciples is hard to explain in and of itself, from despair to these bold men. But here you have an enemy of the church that now has become a bold proclaimer of Jesus Christ. These five facts need to be accounted for historically. They cannot be summarily dismissed in any way whatever. Almost all historical scholars agree on these five facts. You're not going to find a lot of disagreement about these particular five facts here. What event can possibly account for all five of them? Well, I would like to suggest that the best explanation is that Jesus really rose from the dead. However, that's not the only explanation. Other explanations have been suggested, and in our next lecture, I actually want to look at some of the other possible explanations that have been suggested to explain these 5 facts and see are they successful in doing so at that time. We'll see you in the next lecture.